Good evening, everyone. I am very pleased to welcome you to tonight's discussion. This panel discussion is entitled Dartmouth and the Vietnam War, Perspectives on Wartime Service. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Edward Miller. I teach in the History Department in the Asian Studies program here at Dartmouth College. I'm also the instructor for a course here on the history of the Vietnam War that I'm offering this summer. This panel is part of the curriculum and part of the learning for this course. Our audience tonight includes 24 Dartmouth students who are currently enrolled in this course, History 26. It also includes a very large number of alumni viewers who I'm very pleased to welcome to tonight's event. I want to mention here at the outset that we are recording this session, and we do plan to make it available for online viewing later this week, and eventually to publish it on YouTube. I'm going to introduce our three panelists in just a moment, but first I need to say just a little bit about this panel and our goals for tonight. First of all, this panel is sponsored by the Department of History and also by the Dartmouth class of 1964. The class of 64 has a very special relationship to History 26. Going all the way back to 2012, the members of the class of 64 have directly supported the teaching and the learning that my students and I have done in History 26. And this panel tonight is made possible by the generosity of the class. I want to thank in particular two of the current class officers, Hunt Whitaker and Mike Parker. Another member of the class of 64 who's on the call tonight, who I need to single out, is Phil Schaefer. Phil is actually the guy who came up with the idea for this panel. This panel has become something of a Dartmouth tradition over the last decade, and it was Phil who came up with the idea back in 2012. So without Phil, none of this would be happening. In addition to the class of 1964, there's one other Dartmouth class that I want to acknowledge, the great class of 1968. The 68s have been very supportive of a lot of the Vietnam War learning that we've been doing here at Dartmouth, including an oral history program that we run here called the Dartmouth Vietnam Project. I want to especially acknowledge the support of a couple of the 68s, David Peck and Mark Waterhouse. And I'm really pleased, as I said, that so many 64s and 68s have joined us tonight. As far as the goals of this panel, the main idea behind this panel is to explore the theme of service as it relates to the history of the Vietnam War. In recent years in the United States, it's become very common to thank military veterans for their service on behalf of the country. And in fact, this phrase, "thank you for your service," is frequently expressed in all sorts of contexts these days. We hear it at conferences, we hear it at concerts, at professional sporting events. It's also crops up a lot in personal conversations that Americans have with veterans. My own view is that I think this practice of thanking veterans for their service is often undertaken in a very genuine and well-meaning manner, a very heartfelt way. However, I also think that if we just thank veterans for their service and we just leave it at that, we may be missing out on something. And more specifically, we may be missing an opportunity to learn from veterans, to learn about their service experiences. Down at UMass Amherst, there's a historian by the name of Christian Appy, and he's written recently to make an interesting proposal. He says, instead of just automatically saying thank you for your service to veterans and just leaving it at that, he suggests that we should consider asking veterans, please tell us about your service. Appy has argued when we adopt this approach, it can open up lots of new avenues for conversation and for learning. I think in addition to learning about the experiences of veterans, this approach can also help us to learn about other forms of service during the Vietnam War era. Military personnel are not the only people who serve in times of war. There are all kinds of civilians who also perform service, from healthcare to education, to food, aid, and support for war victims. So this topic of service in wartime, I think, is potentially a really rich and valuable one to explore. So this panel is basically an attempt to try to put Professor Appy's advice into practice, and we're going to be exploring some of the connections between Dartmouth College and the Vietnam War by asking these three panelists we have with us tonight to tell us a little bit about their wartime experience their wartime service in Vietnam. The format for tonight's event is going to be as follows. I'm going to introduce each of our three panelists and ask each of them to speak for just a couple of minutes by way of introducing themselves and their experiences in Vietnam during the war. After each of them have had a chance to speak, we will then move to question and discussion. We're going to begin the questions first with the students who are enrolled in the class. I should mention here that all of the students have done a fair amount of work to prepare for this panel event. They have all read written testimony and personal accounts authored by our three panelists. So they're very well prepared, or they should be very well prepared. After we've taken some questions from the students, we'll be very happy to take questions from the alumni in the audience tonight. Because of the size of our audience, I'm going to ask our alumni participants to use the Q&A function on your screen to submit your questions. If you can type those questions into the Q&A, we will then select those questions and present them to the panelists. When you're formulating your question, it's perfectly okay to direct your question either to the entire panel or to one or two of the panelists in particular. Either one of those is fine. Okay, so without further ado, let's begin by hearing from our panelists. I'm going to go in alphabetical order here. The first panelist to speak will be Ivars Bembaris. Ivars is a member of the Dartmouth class of '64. He was born in Latvia during World War II, and as a child, he gained firsthand experience with the deprivation and suffering that civilians often experience in wartime. As a boy, he spent several years living in displaced person camps in Germany. He eventually emigrated to the United States when he was still a young boy. He arrived at Dartmouth in 1960, and while at Dartmouth, he joined the Army's ROTC program out of a sense of obligation to his adopted country. After graduating in 1964, he continued his studies at the Thayer School, earning a master's degree in chemical engineering. In 1966, he went on active duty in the Army, and he was subsequently assigned for training in the area of civil affairs. As many of you know, civil affairs refers to U.S. military activities designed to support civilian populations. So, for example, activities to support aid and resettlement, but also a lot of development activities to provide support to civilian populations in time of war. Ivars ended up spending a year in Vietnam from the fall of 1967 to 1968. He served first as a civil affairs team leader at a resettlement camp in the Central Highlands of South Vietnam. He later served at the Song Mau base area located on the South Vietnamese coast to the west and north of Saigon. I will mention here that Ivars has detailed his experiences in an essay that's included in this book, Dartmouth Veterans. Many of you are familiar with this. This is a collection of essays written by members of the class of '64 who served in the military during the Vietnam era. I should mention here, special thanks is due to the class of '64. They've provided copies of this volume to all of the students who are currently enrolled in History 26. After returning from Vietnam, Ivars worked for more than 3 decades in industry. And Ivars, you now live in Virginia. Is that correct?
Correct.
Great. All right. Well, let me turn things over to you, Ivars, by way of introducing yourself.
Well, I think we can just pass it on to Ron Brown right about now because you covered all the salient points I was going to cover. So I'll skip a few things, but basically, I'm happy to join a panel. And I felt obliged to join the military simply because I was an immigrant. I became a naturalized American citizen, and honor duty country sort of meant a lot to me. Joining ROTC in college was a boon. I was a scholarship student, so a few more dollars certainly helped along the way. But after when I entered the Army, after I completed basic, I had the distinction. My officer's basic course and the basic course in civil affairs. Basic course. I had the dubious honor of being the only officer in my civil affairs class, in my basic class. I'll get this straight before we finish. with advanced degrees who was not sent to a military technical laboratory of some sort. So something was in store for me. I went to the civil affairs school. Then the civil affairs teams in Vietnam were 16 individual teams consisting of from 2 to 3 officers and 4 enlisted men, in theory capable of running cities, if you will, with government engineering and medical expertise. In our case, there were 16 teams scattered all over Vietnam from 1 Corps to 4 Corps, detached to various units. When I came back from Vietnam, if people knew I was from the Ivy League, they would often say to me, well, Ivy Leaguers never got sent to Vietnam. Well, at that time, I wasn't wearing the hat I wear today. I found it ironic because I went to Vietnam. I was for 6 months attached to the 4th Infantry Division, which is also known as the Ivy Division. So the Ivy Leaguer, you got the Ivy in Vietnam for at least 6 months. Very cute. When I was in college, we had a senior seminar on Sundays and a great issues function, and we needed to write an essay of some sort. And I chose my essay to be guerrilla warfare. Someplace in the back of my mind, reading current history, I suspected something was going to happen in the area of the Far East. What I discovered was reading about Che Guevara and all the other greats really didn't help me understand what was happening in Vietnam very much. But I did it nonetheless. It was a requirement for graduation, and you do what you have to do to graduate. All right. One of my pet peeves in the Army was that sometimes they don't listen to you. When I was in civil affairs school, I knew I was going to Vietnam, no doubt about it. I asked for language training using the guise of, hey, I speak 3 languages already. Why not add a 4th? It might be helpful. The reason I really wanted to go, I was married, I had a child at that time, and the language school was in Monterey, California. Now, how could you turn that duty down? They turned me down instead. Well, based on the questions, we may get into some other things, but personally, the Vietnam experience, the military experience, was a tremendous growth period for me on many levels, because I learned so much about me and so much more about the people I worked with. I was a dutiful soldier, but I did test the military, and to understand being in the military during war, sometimes you need some relief. So during my military service, I tested the system a couple of times. A bull colonel on the general's list is if you want, a testosterone monster. He thinks he owns the world because he's going to make general soon. And I was given an order to drill a well for a Vietnam village that we were building for the training site. I had 3 guys drilled 75 feet 3 times and not strike water. The colonel said, hey, are we going to have a well? I said, no, sir, we will not have a well. I thought there would be some repercussions from that, and there were. We had a function of hail and farewell at the end of the serving period of any detachment. And in the hail and farewell, he hailed me for my courage and bid me farewell. The book that you have on Vietnam veterans, I enjoyed writing my essay. And when I got the book, I was totally blown away by the cover. And it basically epitomizes the irony of war. There you see on the covers a soldier with scuffed boots wearing pressed khakis. And in some form of encapsulation, that was a lot about the Vietnam War. Not to belittle the fact that soldiers fought and died courageously, but for every soldier in the field, there were 10 in the rear echelon supporting that soldier. So in some form or fashion, we were the rear echelon. But that picture also was a picture of me. So that was doubly damning. I was not a good soldier. I had creases in my khakis. A little vignette about education, learning, and protest. Upon return from Vietnam, I went to work. It took me a month to get the job I always wanted, so good work. An article appeared in the New York Times showing that there was a sit-in Parkhurst Hall. Now, in those days, Parkhurst was a center of administration. I don't quite remember if it still is now. And big deal. The administration declared a day of a free day off so people could protest. And I wrote the administration a short note suggesting that you cannot subsidize conscience, and that they were subsidizing conscience. And I think I'll leave it at that. I've rambled long enough. I'm just happy to be here. I want to shout out to Nancy. Nancy, in 1950, I got off a boat in New York, and on the dock, there was a Red Cross station, and there were young ladies there. And I walked over and used my first English to anybody in America. And I said, "Donut, please." And she gave me a donut. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Bembaris. And thanks so much for joining us. We're so glad you're here. Our second panelist tonight is Ron Brown. We're actually welcoming Ron Brown, not only welcoming him back to Dartmouth, but also back to History 26, because Ron was kind enough to participate in the last edition of this panel that we did for this class back in 2019. It only seems like a million years ago. Ron was born and raised in New Haven, Connecticut. He is a proud member of the Dartmouth class of 1968. After graduating from Dartmouth, he matriculated to Harvard Law School. And then in November 1968, just 2 months after starting law school, he received a draft notice. He was sworn into the U.S. Army in February 1969. He became a light weapons combat infantryman. By July of 1969, he was on his way to the war in Vietnam, where he was assigned to the Army's 1st Cavalry Air Mobile Division. Following his discharge from the Army, he returned to the U.S. He completed law school. Since then, he's lived in many different parts of the world, including Thailand and other places in Asia. Tonight, he is connecting to us from San Francisco. Ron, welcome back.
Thank you, Ed. Good to be back. I'd like to start by referencing the two narratives that Nancy and Bembaris provided, because they actually resonated with me on 2 points I'll mention. First of all, Bembaris, I had to smile when I read your description of trying to acquire all of the James Michener novels because they were so long, and you felt that they would take up quite a bit of your downtime if you were in Vietnam. I happened to have read Hawaii while I was in Vietnam, so that made me smile to know that there was someone else who was also interested in doing something to keep the boredom down, if you will. And Nancy, you made reference to, I think it was your first helicopter ride, and you said that you thought the pilot was trying to frighten you by flying low over the treetops. And while he may in fact have been trying to do that, I have to tell you that from a purely tactical standpoint, that was a very common occurrence because the lower they flew over the treetops, the more difficult it was to be shot at from the ground. So I laughed when I read that, because when I took my very first helicopter ride from my brigade headquarters, division headquarters, out to my field unit, it was in a similar chopper to yours. And I'll never forget, there were two of us in the seat. And for those of you who are familiar with the setup on these helicopters, it's a bench seat, seats 3 people, and the doors are open. Our pilot lifted off, and I swear he did this on purpose. He did a right turn, 90-degree angle, and the next thing I knew, I was facing the ground. And of course, with the Dartmouth education, I knew centripetal force was going to keep me in the helicopter. But I have to tell you, it scared us. It really did. Going back to something Ed Ed said, he outlined my background somewhat. I was born and reared in Connecticut, did all my education in New England, and quite frankly, had never anticipated that when I was in college, I would probably never leave the East Coast. And although going to Vietnam was a hell of a way to see the world, as a result of my time over in Vietnam, I did get to see Hong Kong on my R&R. And there was something about Asia that just grabbed me. And I made up my mind that when I finished my schooling, I was going to do whatever I could to get back to Asia. And it took me till 1984, having taken a couple of jobs prior to that, which gave me my background in international banking law. I was finally transferred to our bank's legal department in Hong Kong. And I stayed with them for 2 years. And then I transferred over to a multinational corporation where I then spent the next 17 years for a total of 20 years in Hong Kong. And then upon retirement, I, as Ed mentioned, moved down to Thailand, where I've been for the last 17, 18 years. And COVID has kept me from being back in Thailand for the last 2 years. So it's something I'm really anxious to get back to do sooner rather than later. That said, I'd like to pick up on something Ivar has mentioned when he was talking about support troops. And it's something that I read about a lot, and I'm not sure how exactly it was addressed in the class materials, but everyone hears about the number of troops that were in Vietnam at any given time. And the maximum number thrown about is in excess of 600,000, I believe in 68, maybe in some part of 69. And as Ivar has noted, there's about anywhere I've heard from, depending on the unit, anywhere from a 7 or 8 to 10 ratio of support troops, or what I would call combat troops, such as myself out in the field. And if you put it in perspective, you can appreciate that at the height of the war, there were probably no more than maybe 75,000, maybe 80,000 actual infantry ground troops who were trying to fight a war in a jungle that covered the size of Southern California. So when people sometimes express dismay at the number of troops who were in Vietnam and the seeming inability of the Army, the military to convince or be successful, shall we say, in the military campaigns, I got to tell you, 75,000 does not cover a lot of territory. And so there were, as you have probably read, several instances where so-called strategic hills were taken, the most infamous being Hamburger Hill. And shortly after it was captured, the military gave it up. They abandoned it. And a week later, the NVA were back up on the same hill. So from the perspective of the ground troops, such as myself, I hope you can appreciate the frustration that we felt when we were asked to take up a task, accomplish the task, and then had to withdraw, only to find that a week or two later, the same area that we had previously secured was back in the hands of the NVA. So anyway, with that, I'll close and pass on to Nancy.
Thanks very much, Ron. As I said, it's wonderful to have you back. Our third panelist tonight is Nancy Smoyer. Nancy grew up in Princeton, New Jersey. Nancy is not a Dartmouth alum, but she is very much a member of the Dartmouth family and the broader community of Dartmouth alumni. The Smoyer family has a long association with the college. Both Nancy's father and uncle are alumni of the college. Nancy herself is an adopted member of the class of 1967. And as many in the audience know well, Her late brother, Billy Smoyer, who served in the Marines in Vietnam and was killed there, he was a member of that class, the class of 1967. Nancy is not a veteran, but she did serve in Vietnam, and she has a long and very impressive career of supporting and working with U.S. military veterans. In 1967, Nancy volunteered to go to South Vietnam to work on something called the Supplemental Recreation Activities Overseas Program. This was a program run by the American Red Cross in which American women, nicknamed Donut Dollies, spent a year working at recreation centers for U.S. servicemen in South Vietnam. She details her experiences in Vietnam through her wonderful memoir, Donut Dollies in Vietnam, Baby Blue Dresses and OD Green. This is a fantastic memoir. If you're looking to add books to your Vietnam War reading list, I highly recommend this book by Nancy. In the decades since she returned from Vietnam, Nancy has continued to work with and support veterans. She's worked as a Veterans Center counselor in Alaska, which is where she now lives. She's also worked as a volunteer at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. Nancy, as she describes in her book, she made a return trip to Vietnam in 1993, where she met some Vietnamese veterans who served on the communist side during the war. So, Nancy, let me invite you to share a little bit more about yourself with the audience. It's wonderful to have you here.
Well, thank you. Well, first of all, I want to say that to the students that you all know far more about Vietnam than I do, or that I ever want to, because although I've read something like 40 or 50 books about Vietnam, they've all been about or by veterans, because I can't stand to read the history and to see the many times that we did not need to go there and be there. So you all know a lot more than I do. And I'm not going to talk about what I did there, because you all, as Professor Miller has said, you're all up to speed on reading what your readings. But there are a couple things that I noticed in the syllabus that I'd like to address, because they mean a lot to me. And one is that you read or you watched the first episode of Burns Novak series. And although I watched the whole series, I can't remember what the first one was about. And I don't know if any of you have watched any more of it, but I just wanted to say that it did a really good job of presenting the Vietnamese point of view. And also I thought of the anti-war protests or demonstrations. But one of the things that was seriously lacking, and this is supported by veterans I've talked to, was giving the veterans an opportunity or to show the pride that they had in their service. Now, that's not to say that they think everything they did was wonderful or that the war was wonderful or anything like that, but they were so exceptional in what they did as extremely young men, probably your age, and they had so much responsibility and they saw so much and did so much, and they are proud that they were there for the most part. And I think that's something that is seriously lacking and really denigrates the service. So then there's another thing coming up that you're going to read about Lemke, the author who wrote about questioning whether veterans were spat at. And that's been a controversy, ever since day one. And there are those that say it never happened because it was never in the newspapers. There were never any articles about it. I know people that were spat at, and that is not the most important thing that happened to them as a result of their service. There were many other ways that they were degraded. And there's a book, Bob Greene, who was a columnist in Chicago years ago, wrote something in his column where he said to his readers, I keep hearing about veterans saying, we're spat at. Write me and tell me about it. So he wrote a book about that called Homecoming. And to me, the hardest chapter is the one that is entitled, "There are Worse Things Than Being Spat At." And it just tells about the number of ways that veterans were mistreated by the American public. And I've never gotten over that. But having said those negative things, I'm going to say the positive thing that I got out of Vietnam. Well, it changed my life, which is not surprising. While I was there, I knew it was going to be the high point of my life. I said that to one of the other donut dollies, and it's proven to be true. But the gift that I was given was the opportunity to bond with the men under such extraordinary circumstances. And that bond has carried through up till now. That's all. You can tell it still affects me.
Thank you so much for those comments, Nancy, and thank you for reading the syllabus so carefully. And I'm really delighted that you're here and that all three of you are here and participating tonight. Let's go now to some questions, and as I said, we're going to start with questions from the students. And so I'd like to ask all of the students in History 26 to go ahead and turn on your cameras so we can see you. And what I'm going to ask is that each of you, when you have a question, when you want to be called on, use the raise hand function on Zoom so I can see you and call on you. Jack Nicastro has already signaled to me that he has a question. So Jack, if you'll unmute and go ahead and ask your question to the panel, please.
Sorry, my camera's disabled, so apologies for that. But thank you all for coming. Mr. Bembaris, I was wondering, in Hearts and Minds, you mentioned that your wife remarked that it took you 8 years to become normal following your return from Vietnam. And I was wondering, did you ever ask your wife what she meant by this?
Not really. I think just a couple of quick comments. If you've been in military service, especially in combat, there is a high reticence to speak of it, for many, many levels. In my case, I was not a combat soldier, but attitudinally, living with the fear of dying, and anybody in Vietnam had that fear. The roads were mined, snipers were sniping. Somehow, it may be probably somewhat detached, and she decided that after 8 years, somehow I had regained my normal sense of humor or whatever. I wasn't morose. I didn't have nightmares, but she sensed. And as a point of explanation, I started dating her when she was 13. So during the Vietnam War, 1966, I go in. So that's 53 years after. 53 years? No. I'll wake up one of these days. I'm 25, 10 years, 11 years after we met. And so, there was a long courtship, got married on graduation day from Dartmouth, and then disappeared for 2 years to place unknown. So I'm not sure that explains it, but there was something in the demeanor that made me become normal again for sometime later.
Thanks. No, that makes sense.
Another question for our panelists. Maya, you have a question, and then we'll go next to Max and then to Zana. Maya, go ahead.
Well, first of all, thank you all for coming. I really appreciate you guys sharing your stories with us. Mr. Brown, you mentioned that you went back to Harvard Law School after getting home from Vietnam. I was wondering, you mentioned in your article that you only met something like one or two other war veterans while in school. Was there a lot of discussion among you and your peers about the war other than the anti-war protests that were going on, or was it more of like you didn't really talk about it?
There was no real discussion with my classmates generally. The one individual I mentioned in my narrative happened to be a classmate of mine who had been in the Marine Corps as an officer. And he was actually very interested in my experience because, as you know, Marine Corps is a fighting unit, basically all infantry. And he had contracted malaria within the first month of being in Vietnam. So he ended up being shipped back home. And he never experienced combat. And what I found interesting was he was picking my brain to see what combat experience was like. And I found that quite interesting because he seemed almost embarrassed that he had gone through what he had gone through and had never experienced what he thought he had been trained to do. But other than him, there were no other veterans in the law school that I knew about. They may have been there, but there was not the same sense of anyone trying to find out where you had been and what your experiences were. So I never really spoke with anyone other than I had a couple of roommates with whom I spoke, but no one really questioned me about the service other than acknowledging that I had been there. Nobody was, quite frankly, interested, I think, and I understood that. I don't think at the time I was really prepared to talk to them in any event because I don't think they would have understood. And I compare it to if you're a surgeon and you've just been involved in a very long and difficult brain surgery, and you come out and you go out and socialize and meet your friends who are not doctors, what are they going to ask you? So, doc, how did the surgery go? And you say, well, it was successful, or it wasn't unsuccessful, or it wasn't successful. And the conversation really can't go beyond that. They can say, well, what did you think? Well, I was under a lot of pressure, and Ivar's mentioned fear. And someone had said this some time ago, and I found it quite appropriate. It said, fear is wisdom in the face of danger. And I laughed at the time, but in a sense, it really is true. You experience it, and it lives under the surface your whole existence, because from day to day, you don't know what's going to happen to you. And so you're on alert all the time. And that's something that I can sit and have that conversation with you now, but to be honest, I don't think anyone can really appreciate or understand it unless they've gone through it.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
We have another question from Max Weintraub. Max, go ahead.
Thank you. So in this class, we've learned a lot about some of the reasons that the United States was pursuing war in Vietnam and what led them to that. And my question for all of the panelists is, do you guys feel like you were also pursuing some kind of justice when you were there? Did you feel proud to be a part of the American cause in Vietnam, or were you not really as, convinced by what the United States was doing? I guess a better way to ask this is, did your mission align with the United States of America's mission when you were in Vietnam?
Why don't we give that question first to Nancy, and then I'll ask the other two panelists.
Well, my mission was to take the men's mind off the war, but we didn't talk about it for the most part, but I was very careful while I was there to be apolitical. I didn't have opinions about the war, although they did develop during the time I was there, but there was no way I was going to say to somebody that was over there that believed in the cause that they were giving their life, their buddies' lives for nothing. So I was very careful to be apolitical about it.
Ivars, what about you?
I like your question. What if I got his name? Matt? No.
Max.
In the context of my mission in Vietnam aligned with my mission in life, I raised my hand and swore to protect the Constitution of the United States. And I tried to do that. In my background, as was mentioned, I was born in Latvia. Latvia had been part of Russia, became independent in 1918, was annexed by re-annexed by Russia, occupied by Germany. And in that time frame, I went as a displaced person to Germany, came to America ultimately. But a big part of foreign history at the time, or political history, was the domino theory. You know, NATO had to be formed to prevent encroachment on Europe by the Big Red. So in unity, there would be force. The argument was made in Vietnam for the same reason. You know, we had to do something in Vietnam to keep the spread of communism in the Far East. So in that case, it was, it was aligned. Did the war make sense? Who knows? I'll give you one anecdote. As an engineer, I had the ability to harvest a lot of resource. One resource we decided we could employ, D9 is the name of a tractor. We were going to line up every D9 tractor on the west coast of, on the west border of Vietnam and push the country into the South China Sea, because that's the only way the war was going to be won. And end of sermon.
Ron, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, that's a very good question. In my narrative, I think I explained that after I had this conversation with the freshman in New Hampshire who was withdrawing from school so he could join the Marine Corps, he was very clear that he was doing it because he thought it was the thing to do, and being able to have attended Dartmouth, he considered himself to be privileged, and therefore he felt it was his obligation to do his part and not leave service to less fortunate young men. When I went to Vietnam, I didn't do anything to avoid the draft. I didn't try to register as a conscientious objector or any of that, because I had tried to read as much as I could, both pro and con, on our involvement. And probably being somewhat naive, I decided the only way to really find out was to go and experience it firsthand. Not something I would recommend for everyone, but at that time, you're 21 years old. You believe that you're immortal, and yes, I'm going to go and experience it. And having been there, I must say that I look at it now as a macro war, which is what the government told us: fighting communism, prevent the spread of communism throughout Southeast Asia, and the domino theory, save the world for democracy. And then a micro war, which is on a more personal level, one-to-one. The difference to me is that unlike World War II, where Pearl Harbor was attacked, you could actually see yourself defending the country because it was physically attacked and American citizens had been killed by an enemy force. And so, yes, you go and fight that enemy force. But with Vietnam, we didn't have that kind of catastrophic action by the North Vietnamese against the United States, either individually against citizens or against the continent of the United States. So it's very difficult to visualize the North Vietnamese, the Viet Cong, as your enemy. But once you got on the ground, it became irrelevant. You literally realized there's someone on the other side of a rifle who's trying to kill you. And you weren't worried about democracy or imperialism or communism, what have you. You were trying to survive, and you were trying to protect yourself and the men in your outfit. And so that's when I said it comes down to a micro level. And if I could, I'd like to give a little anecdote. I shared this with Ed a couple of years ago. When I was in Vietnam, there were Vietnamese villagers who would come on the base and they would do housekeeping and various and sundry other things. And one day a group of us were sitting around and they were asking us questions about what do you miss most about being back in the United States while you're here in Vietnam? And the question went around and everybody answered. And I remember asking one of the young ladies, well, what do you miss most? And she looked at me straight faced and said, snow. And I'm sitting there saying, wait a minute, we're in South Vietnam. Temperature is 110 degrees. Where did this young lady see snow? And so I asked her, and she looked at me and said, in North Vietnam. And I was speechless for a while and said, well, what were you seeing snow in Vietnam? She said, well, I'm from North Vietnam. And you can imagine my initial reaction is I thought we were fighting the North Vietnamese. And here's this young lady sitting here telling me she was North Vietnamese. And it turned out, as she explained, her family was Catholic. And in 1954, when the demarcation between the North and the South occurred, because of communism and their stance against religion, the Catholics emigrated south. And that's how she ended up back in South Vietnam. And after that encounter, and from that time on, the war became something very personal because she and her family lived in fear of the repercussions that would befall them if the United States left and the North Vietnamese ended up taking over the South. And as I probably, I think, said to Ed a couple of years ago, to this day, I wonder if that young lady ever got to see her snow again. I have no idea.
Thanks, Ron. It's a fantastic anecdote. You know, one of the things that your discussion of the micro war got me thinking. One of the things we discuss in this class is different ways of thinking about the Vietnam War. And one way of thinking about it, which isn't very common in American writing about the war, but is very common in Vietnamese writing about the war, is to think of the Vietnam War as a civil war. And that anecdote you told right there, I think, suggests some of the Civil War dimensions of the conflict. Let's go next to Xana.
Hi, I have a question for Ms. Smoyer. When I was reading your account, I was struck by the contrast between the important work that you were describing of bringing a piece of home to the soldiers and essentially providing uplifting psychological care, and the name Donut Dolly, which, as someone who had never heard that before, comes across almost as belittling. So my question is, how did you feel as though your work was viewed by the people around you? Did you get a sense that it was respected and recognized as the important work that it was? And do you feel as though this perspective has shifted at all as there has become a greater understanding and recognition of PTSD?
Wow, that's a big loaded question. Well, first of all, let me tell you the name of the Donut Dollies came from the Red Cross women in World War II serving donuts. And it carried through to Korea, where they did that, Red Cross did, and then to Vietnam. And as you no doubt know, nicknames were common in Vietnam. Very few guys, a lot of times can't remember their buddies' names except their nicknames. So Donut Dolly was our nickname. And for the most part, we have exceptions, but for the most part, we were very proud of that name. It's not belittling or denigrating at all. In fact, I mean, I wouldn't know what else to call us. Red Cross women, I don't know. So I'm not good at remembering the rest of the question. It had to do with, tell me briefly what the rest of it was. I got carried away with our name.
Yeah, of course. Do you feel as though there has been a shift in a greater understanding of the importance of psychological care as we've learned more about PTSD and seen more of the consequences of that?
Well, yeah, there certainly have been. I mean, the military tries without, but I don't think with much success with preparing people for the aftermath, PTSD. When we were there in 67, 68, even though PTSD and other forms had been around since Bible times, referred to by different names. My favorite is in the Civil War, they called it soldier's heart, or it was shell shock in World War II or I. Anyway, so it was known, but okay, I'm going to go anyway, but it was not understood. And I contend that about 50% of PTSD, of people that have PTSD, is a result of the way they were treated when they came home, not what happened in Vietnam. If they'd been treated better when they came home, they wouldn't have covered it up, which is the way that it metastasizes. So, and as far as having PTSD, I just want to say that PTSD is a disorder of many symptoms, like 5 or 6, 7 symptoms. And so you can have 1 or 2 or 3 of those symptoms, and they may or may not be disruptive to your life. And I have some of those myself, but it doesn't mean that you have been diagnosed with PTSD. So when we were there, we had very little awareness. And as Red Cross girls, oh my goodness, we were there, we were fun and games. We knew what was going on, but we sucked it up.
Nancy, we're starting to get some questions here from our alumni participants in the Q&A, which is great. And all of you should keep those coming. There is one question here that I'd like to ask you right now, Nancy. Hop Potter has asked if you could just explain briefly in more detail what a donut dolly was, what kinds of activities you would do with the servicemen.
Yeah, well, I was hoping that maybe your students maybe got a part of that, but the alumni wouldn't have. So we were on base camps. 4 to 12 girls were on a base camp. Our job was we made up these games that were a cross between a board game and a TV quiz show, and we would make up these games having to do with the states or cars or geography or women or whatever. And we go to either on the base camp, or the best thing to do is to go to a forward area, a fire base or an LZ, and we gather the guys together as much as was reasonable, and then divide them into teams and ask these questions. And so that was one of the things we did. We also served, if the games weren't feasible at an LZ, we would serve meals. So we would have a little bit of contact. We had recreation centers at many of the base camps, not all of them. And that was great, because then you got a chance to really get to know some of the men better, sitting and talking to them. And then we also visited in hospitals, which was the hardest thing to do. The idea was just to make as much contact as we could with the men and to bring sweetness and light to their lives. I know it's absolutely ridiculous to think about doing it, but it worked for the most part. I know you also asked about the reaction. I've talked to veterans since then. Actually, one of them was when I came back and worked in the hospital doing recreation, a military hospital. And one of the men that became a very good friend said that when the girls came, he would leave because he didn't want the tease of talking or seeing a girl and not being able to talk to her. So our role was misunderstood by some. There were other things that were misunderstood about our being there, but I think for the most part, especially once the guys got older and boys stopped being boys, they realized that we were there. We had good intentions and it had some value.
Thanks for that, Nancy. Next question will go to another Max in the class, Max Ranger.
Hi, so I have a question for Mr. Brown specifically. So I found reading your narrative, it was really moving, and especially towards the end when you were talking about the positive life lessons that you've taken kind of from the overall experience, but specifically the basics and the training parts where they were kind of designed to break you down and build you back up. But also specifically, they were an experience of you rubbing shoulders, is how you phrased it, with people that you would never otherwise have associated with. And I thought that was really interesting because the rubbing shoulders phrasing both implies like this proximity that you wouldn't otherwise have and the equal footing. And I think that that's really important. Personally, like I worked from when I was 12 to 16 in the fields because I grew up in rural Michigan with migrant workers, and I took a lot of really important life lessons from that. And so I think that I've never heard that sort of phrasing applied in that context before. But more generally, I'm just wondering how you think you can kind of achieve those lessons in without having to go to war, I guess, because I don't necessarily want to go to war. But I found your piece really moving, and I really like that. So, yeah.
Yeah, in the panel in 2019, I believe that same question came up in slightly different format, but yeah, essentially, how do you accomplish that without going to war? And I had replied then that clearly going into combat was not the way I would encourage people to try and experience the rest of the world. But it's I have always been a proponent of universal service for everyone once they reach the age of 17 or out of high school. And I don't mean military service, but I mean service to the country. Can be Peace Corps. I don't know if it's still around, but we had something back when I was your age, Service to America. I forget what the actual name, Volunteers in Service to America, VISTA. And people would go to rural communities in the United States, underserved communities, and spend time with the people there. And I think it would help everyone at this age to get out and see the country. There's a country of 330 million people. And when you're entitled to go to school, Ivy League schools like Dartmouth and go on to graduate schools, your careers tend to take you into areas that you will never otherwise experience. And so I encourage everyone to try on their own or through career choices, even if you just take off a year, to try to find these volunteer programs and get out and meet the country. I mentioned that in my unit, there was a Hell's Angel, for God's sakes, from Buffalo, New York. A great guy, 19 years old, and he came with all the tattoos. And, you know, we looked at him a bit askance at first, but he was just a normal 19-year-old kid. I met farmers from South Dakota. I met people from Alabama, North Carolina, Wyoming, Montana. I never would have met any of those guys in my life, not at all. And I actually appreciated having the opportunity to spend time with them. And we just sat around and talked about things that everybody our age talked about. There were no politics because in that particular environment, politics were not as divisive as they are now. But we found we had a lot more in common than we didn't have in common. I used to get teased because I was the college guy. There were 6 college graduates in my company, 4 platoon leaders and the captain, all of whom were West Point or ROTC. I was not an officer. And there was one other guy I mentioned who had a PhD in marine biology, of all things. And he was the old man. He was 26. And we used to get teased about being the college guys. And the questions were always, how did you end up out here? You're not going to be out here very long. They're going to give you a job in the rear. And it eventually happened. I got a job in the rear. It wasn't because I was a college guy. It was something else that happened with the lieutenant of mine with whom I had a disagreement. And he decided it was better to get me out of the field. But anyway, going back to the question generally, I think it behooves everyone to really try and get out and meet people whom you would not otherwise get to meet in your school, in your career.
Ron, your answer there, I think, touches on another question that we have here from one of our alums, from Harvey Kettlebaum. He says Vietnam was the last war, the last American war in which soldiers were conscripted. And Harvey wants to ask both you, Ron, and Ivers, what's your opinion on an all-volunteer armed forces versus a conscripted force? Ron, you want to take that first?
It's a good question. I have always been in favor, as I said, of universal service. So I don't know if that would quite answer the question of conscription, meaning military service. But I've been concerned about non-conscripted volunteer army, although people have made the argument that it's the most intelligent and educated army that we've ever had. My concern is political. I truly believe that the army that we now have, the so-called volunteer army, is a class army. A lot of young guys go into the army because there are no other opportunities for them economically, and the army provides them a skill set and a wage, housing, clothing, and food to survive. Unfortunately, the last 20 years, as we've seen, there's been a war. And one of the things I have asked people when this question has come up is everyone talks about the importance of the protests during the Vietnam War. And I ask people, if there had been no draft, would there have been the same level of protest? And then I point to the so-called war on terror, where we have an all-volunteer army. And I have not seen protests of the sizes that we saw during Vietnam in terms of the Iraq invasion and other excursions or involvements of US military. So I do worry that an all-volunteer army is an army that lends itself to politicians being more inclined to use it when they might not be if there were a more shall we say, general composition of the military.
Ivars, what's your view? Should we bring back the draft?
When in the 80s, when we bombed Libya, my son was 18, and I said right then and there, I'm going in for you, because I figured there would be a draft, but I was not going to let my son go. In a sense, I favor an all-volunteer army, and conscription helped in Vietnam. One of the problems we've seen currently over the last 20 years, Nancy talked about PTSD, and I think the way that serving forces have been used over the last 20 years in Afghanistan and that area are highly psychologically damaging. If you talk to current era veterans, my term in Vietnam was 366 days. I went there in 1967. I left in 1968. If you know your history, and you all should know, 1968 had an event. It was called an election. Well, every 4 years during an election, there's an extra day in February. So they got me for the extra day. But the serving forces now had shorter rotations and more frequent rotations. I think nothing can be worse for your psyche than having to go back into the same sandstorm with high frequency. So in theory, I believe in a citizen soldier model. The Spartan with a strong mind and a strong body. How you recruit enough people to do that, it's hard to know. But I would prefer a volunteer force that's dedicated as opposed to conscripted, although the conscriptees performed beautifully every time they were asked to do that in all the wars.
Let's go back for a student question here. Megan, who's been waiting very patiently. Please ask your question.
Yeah, my question is for Mr. Brown specifically, but I think would apply to any of the panelists. So in your reading, you sort of talk about your initial curiosity about the true purpose of the war, sort of driving your motivation to go to Vietnam. And I'm curious to know if you ever felt a shift in attitude among the soldiers in Vietnam, from those who had never been to Vietnam or didn't really know that much about the conflict to actually being involved in it and seeing it firsthand. If you notice any shift in attitudes among those who were fighting.
You mean after I actually got there? It's a good question because I went there out of curiosity and hadn't really formed an opinion until, as I said, once you're on the ground, you tend to micromanage and the war becomes very personal and the politics doesn't get involved as much. I recall after I'd been in the field about 2 months, we had a young replacement come in from Seattle, Washington, 19 years old. And everybody immediately tries to find out, well, how did you end up here? And Nick said, well, I volunteered. And he almost got laughed out of the compound. I mean, every guy there said, you volunteered. He said, what did you volunteer for? And he looked at us with a straight face and he said, to fight communism. And there were a bunch of snickers around the outfit, not ridiculing him, but just realizing that there were people who, in our view, after being 2 and 3 months in the field, were naive enough to believe that we were really there fighting communism. So I don't know if he ever changed his mind. Unfortunately, he didn't survive, so I'll never be able to answer that. But I know from the rest of us, I came away, as I said, believing that we were there correctly, in that we were there to help the people in South Vietnam. And I still think that was a worthwhile cause. The greater supposed strategy of stopping the spread of communism, I have questions about whether that was valid or not. And I can't remember who said this, but I think someone said, the first casualty of war is truth. And so you may be told something to get you into the war, but once you're there on the ground, it takes on a completely different aspect for you. Someone asked me in a previous panel, if I had it to do all over again, would I? And I didn't hesitate. I said, yes, I would, knowing everything I know now. And of course, it's easy for me to say that because I survived it, but I don't regret it. The government, in my view, was wrong. But I believe that the soldiers on the ground, if you can have a two-headed coin, we won the war militarily, the politicians lost the war strategically.
Just to add to that, the mantra kind of is we aren't fighting against, or it's not to fight against communists. Our goal is to stay alive and keep our buddies alive. That's what we're fighting for. Let
me add something also. It's I spend a lot of time working with civilian populations face to face. There were a number of names that they ascribed to. Mine was Winning Hearts and Minds. There was pacification program, lots of things going on. But what I discovered is everybody in Vietnam was struggling to keep alive. I had the fortune to work with ethnic Chinese and Chams. Chams are a group of people who emigrated from India to Southeast Asia. With them, with the village leaders, I was a resource. They figured out, they had needs and they were willing to express the needs. And sadly, the Vietnamese I worked with were simply playing the system. If they did nothing, the Americans became impatient and did for them. So there was this dichotomy of it'll be done for me, or the conscious action on part of village leaders to seek help because help was available. End of point.
Thanks for the great question, Megan, and for those answers. Let's go for our next question to Alyssa.
Hey, this is a question for all the panelists. I was just wondering if your experiences in Vietnam shaped your view on war, specifically U.S. involvement in future wars that we've had since, and if so, how has it been shaped?
Nancy, do you want to take that one first?
Well, my first response was war sucks. I went because I was one of the two things. I was curious about war and I wanted to see what it was like. And I've seen it and it sucks. I don't think our country has learned anything about going to war as witnessed by the involvement in the Persian Gulf. And and Afghanistan and Iraq and the Dominican Republic and Haiti and on and on and on. I'll stop.
Ron, what are your thoughts?
That's a tough one. Time and place for everything. And question is, who determines that time and place is proper? I don't agree with war generally just because it doesn't accomplish anything. It's usually done for political reasons. My observations on what went on in Vietnam, similar to what Ivar said, and again, I'll give you an anecdote. Our combat infantry company is approximately 100 soldiers, and we were in the field for our normal 30-day rotation, and we were replaced by 2 companies of Vietnamese, which about 200. And they had an advisor who was an American, and he happened to have been a classmate at West Point of our commanding officer. And we were standing at the helicopters waiting to get out. And I remember the 2 of them talking, and I heard my commanding officer ask him, he said, "So, what do you think of these ARVN troops that you're advising?" And his classmate looked at him and he said, "They assigned me the South Vietnamese Olympic track team." And our captain looked and he said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, as soon as the bullets start flying, they turn and run." And the captain said, "What do you do?" He said, "I'm right there with them." It just shows the frustration of Americans trying to do the job that should be done by locals. And I saw it and thought about it in Afghanistan and Iraq, where if the American soldiers were there, the feeling was, let them do the dirty work, let them do the job because they're here and they want to do it. And to me, that's not sustainable. So in those contexts, yeah, I would be against war in general. And I don't know if that addresses your question properly, but I guess generally I would say, no, I'm not in favor of war.
No, I think that speaks to it. Ivers, do you have thoughts on this question?
Yeah, just a quick one. Wars of territorial possession or taking possession can be won. Wars of border maintenance can never be won. In World War II, we fought a traditional combat, to take territory and the like. In Korea, it was keep them on the other side of the border. In Afghanistan, in Vietnam, again, it was the maintenance of some kind of political system, and those are wars of attrition, and we'll always lose wars of attrition. And we sacrifice wonderful human beings for somebody else's political mean, and it's not sustainable, and we do a worse job as years go by.
For our next question, let's go to Spencer.
Hi. I just wanted to ask, my grandfather served, and he went back about 4 or 5 years ago before he died. I was just curious if any of you guys have returned to Vietnam after the war, or if you ever would. And if so, talk about it.
Nancy, you have something to say about this?
Yeah, I did go back. I went back in, I don't know, the 90s somewhere, and I went with a group called the Veterans Vietnam Restoration Project. And we were renovating a clinic at Cu Chi, which is where I had been during Tet. Tet was really bad at Cu Chi, and so we were working with Vietnamese veterans, the former enemy, and it was. I went back because I was carrying an anger toward the Vietnamese people and the Vietnamese government, as well as the American people and the American government. But I knew the only way I could get over that was to go there, and. So for the first 3 days, I was just really kind of angry. And then I had an epiphany, and I don't know what it was, but I just realized that it was their country. It always had been their country. We shouldn't have been there. And so it turned around, and I then related to these people like I did on all my travels, which is to get to know them and to work with the enemy. And I got over my anger to the Vietnamese people and the Vietnamese government almost immediately. They suffered so much more than we did. But I'm still angry with the American people and the American government.
Nancy, I like your answer. I make an observation. The reticence to talk about the war, it took my serving unit 35 years to have its first reunion. Now that's not necessarily an important fact of any sort, but it took time. And in some of the reunion meetings, folks started talking about going back, and many did, and with all sorts of tales. Some, they wanted to see the countryside again. Some toured. My feeling on that was I really didn't want to go because I lost too much of myself in Vietnam because one very sad example. I was there during Tet. I was a number of places during Tet, and there was nothing pleasant in Pleiku in particular about using a D9 tractor to dig a ditch for a mass burial ground. I don't know. Yeah, that's not a place you'd like to revisit. So on that basis, I had no desire to go back.
Ron, do you have any thoughts about this?
I haven't been back for probably a different reason from the others. Most of my combat tour was in the jungle. I couldn't tell you one city or town or village from another. And as a result, I don't at this point see any reason why I would go back and try to find the particular places where I was. There were no real pleasant memories, and so I've never really had any desire to go back.
Well, most of the guys who went back would found the LZs, and that's about it.
Right.
I contend that the people, the veterans that least want to go back, are the ones that should go back, and with only one exception, everybody that's gone back, even with negative feelings to start with, come back very glad they went. And nightmares stop, bad feelings. It helped them. It helped.
I have no, let me clear, I don't have any bad feelings or antagonism toward the Vietnamese at all.
Well, about
Not at
people
all.
dying or, you know,
Pardon?
whatever, it could be anything.
So I certainly can't speak from the experience that all of you have. I did have the opportunities, as I think all of you know, I travel to Vietnam frequently. I conduct research there. And back in 2015, I had the opportunity to go with several members of the class of 1964, including some who had served in country. And for them, I think for all of them, it was their first time returning to Vietnam during the war. And I think that for them, that was a very, very meaningful experience. There were other members of the class who didn't want to go, with some who thought about it and decided not to do it. So it is a very personal decision at the end. We have another question here from Maud. Maud, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, definitely. This is kind of directed towards everyone, actually, but I was hoping that you could talk a little bit more about any personal interactions you had with the Vietnamese, and in particular, I'm wondering if these interactions changed your view on the war at all. You guys have touched on that a little bit, but I was just hoping you could elaborate.
Well, Evers worked with them.
Yeah, it's a tough one. I worked a lot with, fortunately, maybe or unfortunately, with non-ethnic Vietnamese, and my reaction is, as an example, the resettlement camp at Da Penang was 8 square kilometers, and we had upwards of 4,000 Montagnard people there. Montagnards are nomadic farmers. They were ripped off their land and basically incarcerated so we could create a free fire zone in a triangle of Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. And I was very close to that border. They had no resource. And I watched the Vietnamese government, drag their feet. They impounded them. They promised to provide planting fields that needed some clearing. They didn't do that. They didn't send proper food. I spoke to the village provincial officials, Vietnamese officials. I could see the warehouses full of goods. We had a really hard time trying to get the Vietnamese to step up to their appropriate duty. And in a sense, the Montagnards generally were treated as substandard citizens, very much in the same manner as American Indians were treated in our early history. So the lack of desire on the part of the Vietnamese to step up and provide necessary services to people really who needed them, soured my feelings about why anybody should be there fighting that war. Like I said, the Vietnamese worked the system. They waited for us to do stuff. The military wanted to take off, so many tasks done. So we did them. But the people were very, very ill served. And again, war was there for decades. These people lived with war. We were just visitors.
We're coming up on the end of our scheduled time here, but we do have a few more questions. Abby Smith has been waiting patiently to ask a question.
Yeah, this one's for Nancy. You talked earlier about kind of your criticisms of the Ken Burns documentary.
I can't hear you.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. You spoke earlier about some of your criticisms of the Ken Burns documentary. I was wondering what piece of media that you feel does the most justice, and it's in the way that it talks about the Vietnam War and the experience of both soldiers and veterans.
I only kind of got part of that.
Yeah, your mic is cutting in and out, Abby. Were you asking about other films about the Vietnam War other than the Burns and Novick film?
Maybe someone else can ask. I think my microphone's messed up.
Well, we heard you fine just there. Try it one more time.
I'm really sorry. I think my microphone's messed up. But I was wondering, like, you talked about the Ken Burns documentary. Like, what piece of media do you think does a good job of speaking to the experience of soldiers and veterans, or maybe even a better job than the Ken Burns documentary?
Oh, films that did a better job. Well, that's a hard one to sort of say, but we were talking about Hamburger Hill, and that movie to me is in some ways the best movie about Vietnam, because it does, and it's been a long time since I've seen it, but it does address the camaraderie among the men. It shows the futility of taking a mountain and taking a hill and then leaving it. And if you know about PTSD, you can see the seeds of PTSD being sown. They talk at one point about how when I go back to the world, I'm going to get my car and my girlfriend, and it's all going to be wonderful. So Hamburger Hill is my go-to movie.
Mine too.
Ron, you agree with that? What about you, Ivars? Do you have a favorite Vietnam War movie or book?
I'll give you the other one. Fathers don't know how to raise their sons sometimes. My son had a chance to go to Annapolis, and at the end he's deciding he's not going to do that. I said, well, Scott, I'm going to park a red Carrera 911 at the front gate the day you graduate. And he said, no, can't do that. And I said, why? Well, my problem is when they give me an order, I'm not going to say aye, sir. I'm going to say why, sir. No, it's now I forgot what the question was.
The question was, do you have a favorite?
Oh, the movie. Okay, I'm sorry, beg your pardon. Even more dramatic, the epic blunder of the Vietnam War movie, Francis Ford Coppola, had a tremendous film about Vietnam in which he succeeded in putting every catastrophe that was ever experienced in Vietnam in that film. So never go see that film.
That of course is a reference to Apocalypse Now.
Yeah, and my son ridiculed me. He said, we walked out of the theater. He says, why'd you do that? Yeah, I failed.
All right, I think we have time for one more question, and that question will go to Angus.
Hey everybody, I'll try to make this quick. But I noticed in Mr. Brown's article that you noted that a lot of the protests you saw when you're taking classes were from more privileged students, and they were waving VC/NVA flags. And I was curious if that was something you saw away from places of like higher learning, if it tended to be where protests were coming from more privileged positions, or if it was more across the board. And that's not just for Mr. Brown, but everybody.
The protests that I personally saw were at Dartmouth before I left, and then at Harvard after I came back. And the ones that I saw at Harvard in Harvard Yard, Cambridge Yard, were the ones where the students, mainly students from the university, were carrying the NVA VC flag. And that was my personal experience. And of course, when it's a protest, to be honest, you don't know whether they're all university students. There may have been students from across the river, from Boston University, Boston College, whatever. But it were clearly students. And again, I had no objection to the protest. It was the waving of the NVA VC flags and the chanting of support for the NVA and VC.
Do we have time for another response, Ed, or not?
Yes, go ahead, Nancy.
There was another kind of protest, and I don't know if he appeared in the first episode of the Burns-Novak thing, but John Musgrave spoke a lot in that. And he was a Marine, and he's a friend of mine. I've known him for 30 years or something. And he was a gung-ho and still is Marine and is so proud of his service. And he came back and joined the Vietnam Veterans Against the War. And he would speak to groups, to veterans, to anybody who would listen about being against the war. And so there was a whole other group of people who are the veterans that protested the war.
That's right. That's a great point to bring up. Actually, in class tomorrow, we have another visitor, the poet W.D. Earhart, who some of you may be familiar with, and he was also a very active member of Vietnam Veterans Against the War. I believe he still is. So that is certainly an important perspective to include. We have hit 9 o'clock, so I think that's a good note to go out on. I want to thank everyone here for participating. I want to thank all of our alumni participants. I want to thank the students for the great questions. But most of all, I want to thank our three panelists, Nancy, Ron, and Evers. Please join me in expressing our thanks to them. This has been a wonderful session. I know I've learned a lot. I think you've given all of us a lot to think, a lot to talk about. I'm really looking forward to our next in-class meeting, because I think there's going to be continued conversation and continued learning. So thank you very much for your participation in this event. It's really been great.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. It wasn't as painful as I thought it would be.
Well, have a good night, everyone. Take care.